In 1970, the mantra in the American Midwest was simple: get big or get out. The banks were handing out loans like candy, and every farmer in Oak Haven County was buying brand new air-conditioned combines. Except for one man. When Gabriel Stone dragged a rusted 30-year-old tractor onto his property, the town didn't just laugh, they bet on the exact date of his bankruptcy. His own brother-in-law called him a disgrace to the family name. But they didn't know that a storm was coming, an economic hurricane that would wipe out the millionaires and leave the fool standing on an empire of dirt. This isn't just a story about farming. It's a story about a betrayal so deep it tore a bloodline apart, and the cold, hard revenge of a man who refused to owe the bank a single dime. The auction at the Grand Miller estate in the spring of 1970 was the social event of the season. It wasn't a bankruptcy auction, not yet. It was a modernization sale. The Millers were shedding their skin, casting off the old ways to embrace the new era of industrial agriculture. The sun beat down on the neck of Gabriel Stone as he stood near the back of the crowd, his boots scuffed and coated in a layer of dry grey dust. He felt small. Around him, men in clean Stetsons and pressed denim shirts were talking about horsepower hydraulics and yield projections. They smelled like aftershave and diesel. Gabriel just smelled like sweat. Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer boomed his voice, a rhythmic chant that hypnotized the crowd. Next up we have a 1948 International Harvester. She's seen better days. Engines seized, tires are shot. Do I hear $50 for scrap? Laughter rippled through the crowd. The tractor was a corpse of iron-bleeding rust onto the green grass. It was an eyesore compared to the gleaming green and yellow giants lined up on the other side of the lot machines that cost more than Gabriel's house. $30, a scrapper yelled from the front. 30 going once. Gabriel raised his hand. It felt heavy like lead. 35. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. Heads turned. The laughter died, replaced by a confused murmuring. Gabriel felt the eyes of his neighbors boring into him. He saw Tobias Reed, the wealthiest landowner in the county, whisper something to the man next to him, a smirk playing on his lips. But the eyes that burned the hottest belonged to Brody Miller. Brody was Gabriel's brother-in-law, Martha's older brother, and the heir to the Miller land. He was standing next to the auctioneer's podium, his arms crossed over a chest that puffed out with the pride of a man who had just signed a loan for $250,000. Art, Brody called out loud enough for everyone to hear. That thing won't even start. Don't embarrass Martha like this. Save your money for groceries. The crowd chuckled again, darker this time. It was pity. Gabriel didn't look at Brody. He looked at the auctioneer. 35. He repeated, his voice steady, despite the trembling in his hands. Sold to Gabriel Stone for $35. As Gabriel walked up to tag his purchase, Brody intercepted him. He leaned in close, the smell of expensive tobacco on his breath. You're making a mistake, Art. The bank approved everyone for the expansion loans. Even you with that rocky patch of dirt you call a farm. Why are you digging through my trash? I don't sleep well when I owe money, Brody, Gabriel said quietly. Brody laughed, a sharp barking sound. Debt is leverage, Art. It's how the world works now. You stick with that junk and you'll be working for me as a field hand by harvest time. Mark my words. That evening, dragging the rusted beast home behind his pickup truck, Gabriel felt the weight of the town's judgment. He pulled into his driveway, the chains clanking loudly in the quiet twilight. His farmhouse was modest, the paint peeling on the porch, contrasting sharply with the Miller mansion up the road. Martha Stone was waiting on the porch. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face pale in the fading light. She looked at the rusted hulk of metal behind the truck, then at Gabriel. She didn't yell. That would have been easier. Instead, her shoulders slumped a gesture of exhaustion that cut Gabriel deeper than any of Brodie's insults. "Brodie called," she said softly, as Gabriel climbed out of the truck. Gabriel stopped. "Did he? He said you bought his dad's junk. He said people were laughing art." She walked down the steps, touching the cold, flaking rust of the tractor's fender. "We have the approval letter from the bank on the table. We could have bought a new tractor. We could have been safe." "Safe." Gabriel snapped, his frustration finally bubbling over. "Martha, look around. Look at the Reeds, the Millers, the Jensens. They're signing papers that promise away their harvests for the next 10 years. If one crop fails just one, they don't own their land anymore. The bank does." "But they're moving forward," Martha cried, tears welling in her eyes. "And we're going backward. I'm tired of struggling art. I'm tired of sewing patches into the boys' jeans while Brodie's wife buys new dresses in the city. You're stubborn. You've always been stubborn. But this is suicide." "It's not suicide," Gabriel whispered, grabbing her hand. It was rough calloused from work, just like his. "It's insurance. They're building castles on sand, Martha. I'm building on rock. It's ugly hard rock, but it won't wash away." She pulled her hand away and went back inside the screen door, slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the empty yard. Gabriel stood alone in the dark, staring at the dead machine. He had spent his last savings on it. He had no seed money left for the spring planting. He had alienated his wife and become the town clown. He went to the barn and grabbed his toolbox. He didn't go inside to sleep. Under the light of a single bulb, Gabriel Stone began to take the engine apart, bolt by rusted bolt. He would make it run. He had to, because if he didn't, Brodie was right, and the thought of working as a hired hand on land that used to be his neighbor's was a fate worse than death. 3 weeks later, Gabriel's hands were permanently stained black. The grease had worked its way into the cracks of his skin, under his fingernails, and into the lines of his face. He looked 10 years older than his 32 years. The barn looked like a battlefield. Parts of the 1948 International Harvester were scattered everywhere. Pistons on the workbench, the transmission gutted on the floor. He had learned that the seized engine wasn't just seized, it was welded shut by years of neglect. He had to soak the cylinders in diesel for a week just to hammer the pistons free with a block of wood and a sledgehammer. Every day the sound of progress taunted him from the road. Vroom, vroom. It was the sound of the new John Deere 402s and the massive International 1456 rolling past his property. The neighbors were planting. They sat high up in their glass cabs, listening to the radio, wearing clean shirts, turning the earth in perfect straight lines with hydraulic ease. Gabriel was still wrenching on a carburetor. One Tuesday afternoon, a sleek black sedan pulled into Gabriel's driveway. Dust billowed around it as it came to a stop. Out stepped Josiah Preek, the senior loan officer at the First National Bank of Oakhaven. Preek was a man who looked like he was made of soft dough squeezed into a suit that was too tight. He carried a leather briefcase that looked more expensive than Gabriel's truck. Gabriel wiped his hands on an oily rag and walked out of the barn. "Mr. Preek, to what do I owe the pleasure I don't recall missing a mortgage payment?" Preek smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. No, Gabriel. You're steady as a clock with the mortgage. Small as it is." He looked around the yard, his eyes landing on the dismantled tractor. "I heard you were tinkering. I came to offer you a lifeline." "I didn't ask for one." "Gabriel, be reasonable," Preek said, stepping closer, lowering his voice as if doing Gabriel a favor. "I had lunch with Brodie yesterday. He's worried about Martha. He's worried about your boys. He says you're not going to get a crop in the ground this year. I'll get it in, Gabriel said, his jaw tightening. With what? Preek gestured to the pile of scrap. That heap. Look, the bank is willing to extend the offer we made in January. We can finance a new tractor, a planter, and seed. We'll consolidate your current mortgage. You can leverage the equity in your 40 acres. Leverage the equity, Gabriel repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. You mean put my land up as collateral? So if I have a bad year, you take the farm. Everyone has bad years, Gabriel. That's what refinancing is for. It's a cycle. It keeps the economy moving. Preek checked his watch. The offer stands until Friday. After that, we assume you're bowing out of the farming business. Brody has already expressed interest in leasing your acres if you decide to sell. The mention of Brody leasing his land made Gabriel's vision blur with red-hot anger. Tell Brody to worry about his own notes, and tell your boss I'm not signing my land over to anyone. Preek's smile vanished. Pride is an expensive luxury, Mr. Stone. I hope you can afford it. He drove away, leaving Gabriel standing in the exhaust fumes. Gabriel went back into the barn. He picked up a wrench and threw it as hard as he could against the wall. It clanged loudly, startling a pigeon from the rafters. He sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. He was tired, so incredibly tired. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just a fool fighting the tide of history. Daddy! Gabriel looked up. His youngest son, Timmy, was standing in the doorway holding a glass of lemonade. He was 7 years old with Martha's eyes and Gabriel's stubborn chin. Mama said you were thirsty, Timmy said, walking over carefully to avoid the grease spots. Gabriel took the glass, his hand shaking slightly. Thanks, Bud. Is the tractor fixed yet? Timmy asked, looking at the skeleton of the machine. Uncle Brody says it's dead. Uncle Brody doesn't know everything, Gabriel said, taking a long drink. The lemonade was sour and sweet, just the way Martha made it. Can I help? Timmy asked. Gabriel looked at his son. He looked at the machine that was supposed to save them. Yeah, Gabriel choked out. Yeah, Bud. Grab that flashlight. Hold it right here. That night they worked until midnight, and finally around 2 a.m. Gabriel sat in the metal seat. He had reassembled the fuel lines. He had filed the points. He had prayed. Stand back, Timmy, Gabriel said. He turned the key. The starter whined a slow, agonizing groan. Roar. Nothing. Come on, Gabriel whispered. Come on, you old girl. Roar. Silence. Gabriel hit the steering wheel. Damn it. Timmy shrank back. Gabriel took a deep breath. One more time. He adjusted the choke. He pumped the throttle. Roar, kapow! A gunshot-like backfire shook the barn, followed by a cough of black smoke that filled the air. And then, chug, 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 chug. The rhythm was rough, uneven, but it was there. The old International roared to life, shaking violently, spitting oil and smoke, but running. It sounded like a heartbeat, a loud, angry heartbeat. Gabriel looked at Timmy. The boy was grinning, his teeth white against his soot-stained face. Gabriel laughed. It was a maniacal, exhausted laugh. He had done it. But the victory was short-lived. The very next morning, Gabriel took the machine out to the fields. He was weeks behind his neighbors. Brody's corn was already sprouting green rows, visible from the road. Gabriel was just starting to plow. He pushed the old tractor hard. The ground was wet, heavy clay. The tractor struggled, the engine temperature gauge climbing into the red. He had to stop every hour to let it cool, pouring water from the creek into the radiator. It was slow, back-breaking work, but he was making progress. Until the third day. Gabriel was plowing the south field, the one bordering Brody's property line. He saw Brody's massive new combine parked near the fence, gleaming in the sun. Brody wasn't there, but his hired hands were watching Gabriel struggle with the old machine. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed across the field. The tractor lurched to the right and slammed to a halt. Gabriel was thrown against the steering wheel, winding him. He climbed down, his heart sinking. The rear axle. It hadn't just broken, the wheel was skewed at a sickly angle. Gabriel knelt in the mud. He inspected the brake. The metal was sheared clean. But as he looked closer, wiping away the mud, his blood ran cold. On the underside of the axle, housing near the brake, there were deep, shiny scratch marks. Not the scratches of wear and tear. These were straight uniform marks, saw marks. Someone had taken a hacksaw to the axle, not enough to cut it through, but enough to create a stress point. Enough so that when the tractor hit the heavy clay torque, it would snap. Gabriel stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked across the fence line toward the Miller estate. This wasn't just ridicule anymore. This wasn't just economics. This was war. Gabriel Stone didn't go to the sheriff. Sheriff Grady played poker with Brody Miller on Friday nights, and Gabriel knew better than to bet against the house. Instead, he wrapped the sheared end of the axle in a burlap sack, the metal still heavy and cold, and threw it into the bed of his truck. The drive into town felt like a funeral procession. The Oakhaven General Store and Feed was the heartbeat of the county, the place where coffee was stale, the gossip was fresh, and the hierarchy of the town was established every morning by who sat at which table. When Gabriel walked in, the bell above the door chimed a cheerful sound that clashed with the thundercloud look on his face. The store was full. It was lunch hour. At the center table sat Brody Miller, surrounded by Tobias Reed and a few other prominent farmers. They were laughing, their plates piled high with fried chicken. Brody was wearing a new watch gold, glinting under the fluorescent lights. The laughter died slowly, row by row, as men noticed Gabriel. He didn't buy coffee. He didn't nod hello. He walked straight to the center table and dropped the burlap sack onto the checkered tablecloth with a heavy, dull thud. The silverware clattered as the men jumped. "What is this art?" Brody asked, wiping grease from his lip with a napkin. He looked annoyed, not scared. "We're eating!" Gabriel reached into the sack and pulled out the broken axle shaft. He slammed it upright on the table. The saw marks were visible to everyone, silver scars cutting through the dark, grease-stained steel. "You have a clumsy hired hand, Brody," Gabriel said, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous calm. Or maybe he just has good hearing. Maybe he heard his boss complaining about the eyesore next door. Brody looked at the axle, then up at Gabriel. He didn't blink. "I don't know what I'm looking at, Art. Looks like old metal finally gave up. I told you that tractor was junk." "That's a cut," Gabriel hissed. "A hacksaw cut, made while the tractor was parked in the south field. Your side of the fence." Tobias Reed leaned forward, looking at the metal. "Now hold on, Gabriel. That's a serious accusation. You saying Brody sent a man to vandalize your property?" "I'm saying," Gabriel said, looking around the room, making eye contact with every man who had laughed at him at the auction, "that if anyone steps foot on my land again, I won't be coming to town to talk about it. I'll be handling it in the field." Brody stood up. He was a big man, fed on steak and confidence. He loomed over Gabriel. "You're losing your mind, Art. The stress is getting to you. You bought a heap of scrap, it broke, and now you're looking for someone to blame because you can't afford to fix it. It's pathetic." He turned to the room. "Doesn't it just break your heart?" "The man is desperate." A few men chuckled nervously. They didn't want to, but Brody held their mortgages or leased their land. They had to laugh. Gabriel stood there for a long moment, realizing the truth. It didn't matter if he had proof. In Oakhaven, the truth was decided by the man with the biggest checkbook. He was alone, truly alone. He grabbed the axle, turned on his heel, and walked out. He didn't hear the bell chime this time. All he heard was the blood rushing in his ears. He couldn't afford a new axle. The part for a 1948 International was obsolete, and a custom machine shop would charge him 3 months' worth of grocery money to fabricate one. The tractor sat in the mud, a 3-wheeled cripple. For 2 days, Gabriel didn't sleep. He sat in the barn, staring at the broken metal. Martha brought him sandwiches that went uneaten. She didn't ask what happened at the store. The gossip had already reached her via the church telephone line. She knew Gabriel had threatened her brother. She moved around the house like a ghost, afraid to speak, afraid to shatter the fragile tension holding their family together. On the 3rd morning, Gabriel did something reckless. He drove 2 towns over to a junkyard run by a hermit named Silas. Silas was known for hoarding useless iron. "I need an axle for a 48, Gabriel told the old man. Silas spat tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Rare bird. Don't have it. I got an axle from a 52 dump truck, though. Heavy duty. Too big for your rig." "I'll take it," Gabriel said. "It won't fit, son. I have a torch and a welder. I'll make it fit." For the next week, the stone farm sounded like a war zone. The hiss of the acetylene torch and the crackle of the arc welder echoed late into the night. Gabriel cut the housing of his tractor. He shortened the truck axle. He wasn't a master fabricator. His welds were ugly, bubbling ridges of metal that looked like scars. But he laid bead after bead, melting the steel together with a desperate intensity. He wasn't just fixing a tractor. He was welding his own spine back together. When he finally bolted the monstrosity back onto the tractor, the rear left wheel stuck out 3 inches wider than the right. It looked absurd. It looked like a Frankenstein machine. But when he let the clutch out, the torque transferred. The truck axle designed to haul tons of gravel laughed at the farm mud. It was stronger than the original ever was. Gabriel finished his planting in mid-June. He was a month late. His corn would be short. His yield would be low. When harvest came that fall, the neighbors were bringing in record crops. The Reeds bought a new Cadillac. Brody Miller built a heated swimming pool in his backyard. Gabriel harvested his meager crop. He made just enough to pay the property taxes, the seed bill, and put food on the table. There was no profit. There was no new truck. On Thanksgiving, the family gathered at Brody's house. Martha insisted they go for the sake of the children. Gabriel sat at the end of the long mahogany table, wearing his only suit, which was shining at the elbows from age. To prosperity. Brody toasted, raising a crystal glass of wine. Corn is up to $1.30 a bushel. The bank says land values are going to double in 5 years. We are sitting on a gold mine, gentlemen. "Hear, hear," the men cheered. Brody looked down the table at Gabriel. "And to Gabriel," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, who managed to scrape by. "You know, Art, I saw that. Repair you did. It's dangerous. You really should let me co-sign a loan for a new John Deere next year. I hate to see my sister's husband driving a death trap." "The tractor runs fine," Gabriel said, quietly cutting his turkey. "But for how long?" Brody smiled. "The future is coming, Art. You can't weld the past back together forever." Gabriel looked up. His eyes were hard. "The past is paid for, Brody. Is the future—" The table went silent again. Brody's smile twitched. He took a long sip of wine. "The future belongs to those who can afford it." Gabriel didn't say another word. He ate his meal, knowing that while they were feasting on credit, he was the only free man at the table. The early 1970s were a hallucination. There was no other way to describe it. In 1972, the Soviet Union suffered a catastrophic crop failure. Desperate for grain, they secretly bought millions of tons of American wheat and corn. Almost overnight, the price of grain exploded. In Oak Haven, it rained money. Corn went from $1.30 to $3, then higher. Soybeans hit astronomical numbers. Farmers who had been scraping by suddenly found themselves holding checks for $50, $60, $100,000. The get big or get out. Philosophy wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was a religion. The banks threw their doors open. Josiah Preek was no longer just a loan officer. He was a celebrity. He drove around the county in a Lincoln Continental, handing out loans like a priest granting absolution. "Buy land," Preek told everyone. "They aren't making any more of it. Inflation is here to stay. If you don't borrow, now, you're losing money." The logic seemed sound. If inflation was 10% and the interest rate on the loan was 7%, the bank was effectively paying you to borrow money. Land prices skyrocketed. An acre that cost $400 in 1970 was selling for $1,200 by 1974. Gabriel Stone watched it all from the seat of his Frankenstein tractor. He made money too. The high grain prices applied to everyone. For the first time in his life, Gabriel had a surplus, a significant one. In 1974, after harvest, he sat at his kitchen table with a check for $28,000. Martha stared at it, her hands shaking. "Art," she whispered. "We can fix the roof. We can get Timmy braces. We can get a new truck." Gabriel looked at the check. He felt the pull. God, he wanted to spend it. He wanted to walk into the dealership and point at the shiny red pickup in the window and say, "I'll take it." He wanted to show Brody. But then he looked out the window. He saw the neighbor Paul Jensen tearing down his old barn to build a massive automated grain drying complex. Paul had borrowed $500,000 to do it. "We're going to fix the roof," Gabriel said, "and Timmy gets his braces." "And the truck?" Martha asked, hope rising in her voice. "No truck," Gabriel said. "We're going to pay off the mortgage on the 40 acres. Martha slammed her hand on the table. "The mortgage is tiny, Art. The interest rate is 3% from the old loan. Preek said we'd be fools to pay that off. We should use this cash to put a down payment on the hillside plot." "I don't care what Preek says," Gabriel shouted, standing up. "I don't want to owe anyone. Look at them. Martha, look at Brody." Brody had gone mad with expansion. He had bought 3 neighboring farms. He was farming 2,000 acres now. He had a fleet of 4 brand-new combines that moved across the land like a mechanized army. He was leveraging every acre he owned to buy more. He was a millionaire on paper. "Brody is a success," Martha yelled back, tears streaming down her face. "He's sending his kids to private school in the city. He's taking his wife to Paris. And we're still driving a rusted truck and living like paupers. Why do you hate success, Art? Why do you hate us being happy?" "I don't hate success," Gabriel said, his voice trembling. "I hate the noose. They're standing on a trap door, Martha, and they're too busy looking at the sky to look down." "You're just jealous," she spat. "You're jealous because he was right and you were wrong." She stormed out of the kitchen. Gabriel sat alone with the check. He felt a deep, aching cold in his chest. He was winning his war against debt, but he was losing his wife. The next day, Gabriel went to the bank. He walked into Preek's office. Preek looked up, smiling. "Gabriel, I saw your harvest numbers. Impressive yield for older equipment. You're here to talk about the hillside plot. I assume Brody is eyeing it, but I held off on the paperwork because I know it borders your land." "I'm here to pay off my mortgage," Gabriel said, placing the check on the desk. "In full." Preek blinked. He looked at the check, then at Gabriel. He laughed nervously. "Gabriel, let's be rational. Inflation is at 12%. Paying off a low-interest loan is mathematically illiterate. You should be using this capital to expand. You need to leverage. I want the deed." Gabriel interrupted. "I want the piece of paper that says this land is mine, not the bank's. Mine." Preek sighed, his face tightening. "Fine. If you want to stay small, stay small. But I'm warning you, Gabriel. The world is moving on. The small family farm is a dinosaur. You're preserving a corpse." Gabriel paid it off. He walked out of the bank with zero debt. He had $4,000 left over. He didn't buy a new tractor. Instead, he went back to Silas's junkyard. He found a 1955 combine that had been in a barn fire. The tires were melted, the paint was scorched, but the engine block was solid. $200, Silas said. Gabriel towed it home. The winter of 1975 was brutal. While the neighbors vacationed in Florida, Gabriel spent every waking hour in the freezing barn. He sandblasted the scorched metal. He rewired the entire electrical system. He replaced every belt, every hose, every bearing. He was building a fleet of the undead. Brody stopped by one afternoon in February. He pulled up in a brand-new Mercedes-Benz, the tires crunching on the snow. He didn't get out of the car. He rolled down the window, the heat blasting from inside. Gabriel walked over, wiping grease from his hands. "I bought the hillside plot," Brody said, blowing smoke from a cigar into the cold air. The hillside plot was the land directly above Gabriel's farm. It controlled the drainage for the valley. "You paid too much," Gabriel said. "It was worth it." Brody grinned. "I'm going to terrace it for corn next season. Just thought you should know. Runoff might be a little heavy on your side. You might want to dig some ditches. You terrify that hill and you'll wash my topsoil away," Gabriel warned. "Then maybe you should sell," Brody said. "I'll make you a generous offer, Art. I'll buy you out. House barn the 40 acres. You can keep your scrap metal. I'll even give you a job managing the grain bins. You're good at fixing things. You'd make a decent mechanic for me." Gabriel looked at the man who used to be his friend. He saw the bloat in Brody's face, the redness in his cheeks from too much rich food and too much stress. Brody's eyes were darting, never staying still. "You don't own that land yet, Brody," Gabriel said. "The bank does." "Same difference?" Brody scoffed. "Think about the offer, Art. Martha would love the manager's cottage. It has a dishwasher." Brody rolled up the window and drove away. Gabriel watched the Mercedes disappear. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, stained, and shaking with rage. But as he looked back at the barn, at the resurrecting combine, a strange calm settled over him. He knew something Brody didn't. He felt it in the wind. He saw it in the way the prices were fluctuating wildly, in the way the interest rates were starting to creep up, inch by inch. The party was getting too loud. The music was playing too fast. Gabriel went back into the barn and picked up his wrench. He tightened a bolt on the scorched combine. Click. "Let it rain," Gabriel whispered to the darkness. "Let it rain." The end of the dream didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a letter in the mailbox. In October 1979, the Federal Reserve, desperate to curb the rampant inflation, raised interest rates. In Oak Haven, the farmers didn't pay much attention at first. They were busy bringing in another harvest. But then the rates kept climbing. 12%, 15%, 18%. By 1981, prime interest rates hit an agonizing 21.5%. For Gabriel Stone, this meant nothing. He had zero debt. His bank account sat quiet and safe, earning high interest on his savings. For Brody Miller, it was a death sentence. Brody had financed his empire on variable-rate loans. When he borrowed the money for the hillside land and the new combines, the interest was 7%. Now the bank was demanding 20%. His annual interest payments alone were suddenly more than his entire projected profit for the year. The winter of 1982 was the coldest on record. The ground froze hard like iron. Gabriel was in his shop welding a reinforcement bar onto the header of his 1955 combine. The heat from the stove made the shop the only warm place on the farm. The door creaked open and Martha walked in. She wasn't holding a sandwich this time. She was holding a coat, shivering. "Brody's electricity got cut off," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel lowered his welding mask. The blue afterimage of the arc danced in his eyes. "What? They turned it off, Art. He missed 3 payments. There's frost on the inside of their windows. The kids." She started to cry. "He won't ask for help. You know he won't." Gabriel turned off the welder. The silence in the shop was heavy. He thought about the insults, the laughter at the auction, the way Brody had threatened to buy his home. "Get the generator," Gabriel said, "and load the truck with wood." They drove to the Miller mansion. The driveway, once lined with manicured hedges, was overgrown. The massive John Deere tractors sat in the yard, covered in snow, looking like sleeping dinosaurs. They were silent. Useless. Without diesel, which Brody couldn't afford, they were just expensive paperweights. Inside the house was dark. Brody was sitting in the kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, staring at an empty fireplace. He looked like a skeleton of the man he used to be. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes hollow and rimmed with red. He didn't look up when Gabriel hauled the generator onto the back porch and ran the extension cord into the kitchen. He didn't speak when Gabriel brought in an armful of firewood and lit the stove. Only when the warmth began to fill the room did Brody look at Gabriel. "Why?" Brody croaked. His voice was brittle. "Because it's cold," Gabriel said simply. "I called Preek," Brody whispered, staring into the flames. "I asked for an extension, just until harvest. You know what he said. He said my assets are non-performing. He said he's sending the appraisers next week." Brody laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I own 2,000 acres, Art. I have $1 million in equipment, and I can't buy a tank of propane." "You don't own the acres, Brody," Gabriel said gently. "You never did." "I was the king of Oakhaven," Brody murmured as if he hadn't heard him. "I was the king." The spring of 1983 brought the final blow. It wasn't the bank, it was the weather. The rains came early and hard. The hillside plot, the one Brody had terraced against Gabriel's warning, couldn't hold the water. The drainage systems Brody had installed were cheap. He had cut corners to pay the interest on his loans. Gabriel was eating breakfast when he heard the roar. It sounded like a freight train. He ran to the porch just in time to see the hillside give way. A massive slide of mud water and debris cascaded down the slope. It crashed through the fence line, burying Brody's lower fields in 3 feet of sludge. But it didn't stop there. The mudslide rolled onto Gabriel's property, smashing into his equipment shed. Gabriel ran out into the rain. The shed was half collapsed. The roof had caved in on top of his 1948 International, the tractor that had started it all. Gabriel fell to his knees in the mud, digging frantically with his hands. No, 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 no. He cleared the debris from the hood. The metal was dented, the exhaust stack crushed. But the frame, the truck axle he had welded on, it held. The roof beam was resting on the reinforced axle, saving the engine from being crushed. Gabriel sat back in the rain, panting. He looked up at the hillside. Brody's land was ruined. The topsoil was gone, washed away into the creek. The asset the bank was counting on was now worthless. A black car pulled up the road. It wasn't Preek. It was the sheriff. Gabriel stood up, wiping the mud from his face. He watched as the sheriff's cruiser stopped at the Miller gate. He watched as they taped a piece of orange paper to the front gate. Notice of foreclosure. Brody Miller, the man who bet on the future, had just run out of time. The auction took place in the fall of 1985. It was the closing chapter of the Oakhaven crisis. This time, the atmosphere at the Miller estate was not festive. There was no fried chicken. There was no laughter. The mood was ugly. Farmers stood in clusters wearing dirty caps, their faces hard and angry. Many of them had lost their own farms or were on the brink. They weren't here to buy. They were here to mourn. Josiah Preek stood on the porch of the mansion, flanked by 2 armed security guards. He looked nervous. He knew that in other counties, auctions had turned into riots. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began his voice, lacking the rhythmic bounce of the glory days. "We are selling the entirety of the Miller estate, land equipment and residential holdings." Brody wasn't there. He and his family had moved into a small rental apartment in the city 3 days prior. He couldn't bear to watch. But Gabriel was there. He stood in the same spot he had stood 15 years ago. He wore the same boots, but he didn't look small anymore. The men around him, men who had mocked his junk tractor, nodded at him with respect. Gabriel Stone was the only man in Oakhaven who hadn't asked the bank for a dime in a decade. "First item," the auctioneer called. "The John Deere fleet, 4 combines, 1978 models, low hours." The bidding was sluggish. No one had money. The prices were pennies on the dollar. A corporate buyer from Chicago, a man in a sharp suit named Mr. Vane, was snapping everything up. "Sold to buyer number 104, the auctioneer droned. Vane smirked. He was buying the heart of the community for scrap prices. Then came the land. "The Miller homestead," the auctioneer announced, "including the remaining arable acreage and the farmhouse. Starting bid at $150,000. Silence. That was a steal. The land was worth $500,000 10 years ago. But $150,000 might as well have been $10 million to the broke farmers in the crowd. "Do I hear $100,000? Mr. Vane raised his paddle. 100,000. "I have 100. Do I hear 110? The crowd murmured. If Vane bought it, he would bulldoze the house and turn the land into a tax write-off corporate farm. The Miller legacy would be erased. Gabriel reached into his pocket. He pulled out a certified bank check. It represented 15 years of savings, 15 years of fixing broken parts, 15 years of driving a rusted truck, 15 years of being called a fool. Gabriel raised his hand. 110. Preek's head snapped up. He squinted at Gabriel. Mr. Vane looked annoyed. He raised his paddle. 120. 130. Gabriel called out his voice, ringing clear across the yard. The crowd turned. Martha, standing by the truck, held her breath. 140. Vane counted. Gabriel closed his eyes for a second. He thought about the Frankenstein combine. He thought about the nights in the freezing barn. He thought about the trap door Brody had stood on. $160,000. Gabriel said. Vane hesitated. He looked at his notes. The land was damaged from the mudslide. It needed work. It wasn't worth a bidding war. He lowered his paddle. Going once, going twice. The gavel slammed down. Bang. Sold to Gabriel Stone. A cheer went up from the crowd. It was a ragged, defiant cheer. One of their own had won. 2 weeks later, Gabriel drove his pickup truck to the city. He pulled up to a shabby apartment complex. He walked up the stairs and knocked on door 4B. Brody opened it. He looked like an old man. He was working as a night janitor at a high school. "What do you want, Art?" Brody asked, his eyes dull. "You came to gloat. You own it all now. My dad's land. My house. You won." Gabriel took off his hat. "I didn't buy it to win, Brody. I bought it so Vane wouldn't." Gabriel pulled a set of keys from his pocket. I need a manager. The farm is too big for me and Timmy to run alone. I need someone who knows the land, someone who knows where the drainage needs to be fixed. Brody stared at the keys. You're hiring me to work on my own land. It's not your land anymore, Brody, Gabriel said sternly. It's the bank's land that I liberated, but it's your home. Martha wants you back. The house is waiting. You pay me fair rent, and you run the North Fields. But we do it my way. Your way, Brody asked, tears welling in his eyes. No debt, Gabriel said. We fix what breaks. We don't buy new until the cash is in the tin can, and we drive the old iron until the wheels fall off. Brody reached out his hand, trembling, and took the keys. The old iron, he whispered. Yeah. Okay, Art. Okay. The year is 1990. The sun is setting over the Stone Miller farm. It is a massive operation, now a patchwork of fields that survived the worst economic crisis in agricultural history. In the middle of the field, a machine is running. It's ugly. The paint is a mix of red and green and rust. The rear axle is from a dump truck. The engine is from a 1955 combine. It looks like a monster. But it runs. Gabriel Stone, now grey-haired, sits on the porch, drinking iced tea. He watches his son Timmy, now a grown man, driving the 1948 International. The machine is loud. It smokes. It rattles. But as it cuts through the golden wheat, turning the harvest into profit that belongs 100% to the family, it makes the most beautiful sound in the world. It sounds like freedom. Gabriel Stone didn't have a degree in economics. He didn't have the support of the banks, and he certainly didn't have the respect of his neighbors. All he had was a toolbox, a refusal to be a slave to debt, and the wisdom to know that new doesn't always mean better. While the smart money chased the horizon and fell off the edge of the world, the man with the rusted tractor plowed a straight line through the storm. He proved that true wealth isn't measured by what you can borrow, it's measured by what you can keep. In a world of shiny promises and easy credit, Gabriel Stone was the iron anchor that held fast. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten histories with more people. And here is a question for you. In your own life, are you buying the shiny new tractor on credit, or are you building your empire on old iron? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story of survival, betrayal and redemption. Thanks for watching.